In the year 1078, there was a monk in the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, France, who spent countless hours trying to come up with a singular proof for the existence of God. This monk spent many days and nights searching for the perfect argument, that argument which no greater argument could be conceived.
I kept my mind on this thought, and sometimes it seemed that I was on the verge of grasping what I sought. Yet not only did it always escape me, but it seemed I was ever more nearly losing what I grasped. Finally, despairing of finding it, I was about to put the thought aside when, though the light of truth seemed almost to be slipping away from me, it still kept urging itself upon my mind, so that although I tried to put it away, it always renewed itself again.
His mind, constantly occupied with this task, was invaded even during prayer and when attempting to engage in his duties as abbot. Yet this effort was not without fruit, as he released his argument in his work The Proslogion and birthed the most ridiculous argument the philosophical world had yet seen. So ridiculous that it worked, and worked well.
This monk is known as Anselm of Canterbury. His argument was known as the Ontological Argument, and it has been known as one of the most, if not the most, controversial arguments in the scholastic period. But it's not controversial because it sucks. It's controversial because it's tough to understand, because this argument functions at the most fundamental part of the logical axiom, existence itself. And by the end of the argument, even if you think it's about as useful as a football bat, you'll see that the position that there is no God is really impossible. And the question actually is whether or not God is personal or impersonal. Before we begin, it's important to note that this isn't an argument for a particular God, but rather a generic definition of God. And for this argument, we define God as the greatest being conceivable, that which no greater being can be conceived. And to set it up, we establish first our foundation by explaining the concept of a necessary being. The necessary being is something that has to exist based on preconceived logical foundations. For example, based on the foundations of math, the number 1 literally cannot not exist. Let me explain. Based on the language of math, there can't not be a first positive integer. I can't start counting by saying 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. I mean, I could, but even though I'd be starting the sequence of numbers with 2, that 2 would still represent the first positive integer in the series. Even though the physical symbol or the vocal symbol, like the sound of me saying the number 2, can change, the mathematical concept transcends the physical symbol and remains unchanged as the first positive integer. Now, what the heck does all this hoopla have to do with an argument for God? Everything. Our example with math works because math functions at the more fundamental axiom of logic. Matter of fact, every axiom first functions at the level of logic, because if it didn't, there would be chaos. Imagine if you could go up and down at the same time, or a square could be a square and a circle at the same time. We can rely on these things not being the case because our reality functions under the laws of logic, and because of this, we have the ability to have things like science, philosophy, and knowledge as a whole. Because of the reliability of these laws of logic, we can prove things that aren't observed or obvious in themselves, things like God. Consider again our definition of God. The greatest thing conceivable, which no greater thing can be conceived. Off the top, is there anything about this definition that makes us say, no, that can't exist because it doesn't make sense, it's not logically coherent? Can you at least imagine a hypothetical world where this being actually does exist? Yes, you can. And this tells us that there aren't any logical contradictions and this being could possibly exist. But if our definition holds true, this being can't just exist in some hypothetical situation, but it has to exist in every possible situation, and here's why. If we say that it could exist but doesn't, we're saying that this thing is reliant on something else for its existence. If we hold to our definition and say, yes, the greatest possible thing imaginable could exist if it weren't for this other thing, then ipso facto, we're saying that whatever our being is contingent on is actually greater than our being, and we're not upholding to our original definition, the greatest being conceivable. Yet, if we hold true to our definition and this thing is the greatest, there could be nothing holding it back from actually existing, which means it actually exists. Our sheer mental capacity for this being and its basis in the logical axiom confirms we indeed do have a God. Bear with me though. I know it probably doesn't make sense and sounds dumb, and I'm about to fix that and explain, so stay with me for at least a few more minutes. If you watch all the way through and still thinking I'm an idiot for thinking this is the best argument for God, please drop a comment and call me an idiot. So we established this greatest being has to exist, and here's a reason why. If we can judge anything on a scale of greatest to worst, there naturally has to be something at the top of that scale. For example, if I want to measure a yard, I first need a yardstick because the yardstick itself is the longest distance on my scale of reference. In a similar way, for me to judge greatness, I first need to have a knowledge of the top of the scale of greatness, and the top of that scale is the greatest possible thing that could be conceived. Now, many will say, like I said when I first heard this argument, okay, yeah, but based on this logic, I could say anything is the greatest possible thing imaginable, and therefore it has to exist. And it's a valid objection, but let's refer back to our definition so we could win the medal for saying the greatest possible thing conceived, that which no greater thing can be conceived, the most amount of times. This being is necessary for two reasons. One, because we have a scale of greatness by which necessity requires something to be at the top of that scale. And two, because it is the greatest possible thing imaginable by definition. And by this definition, it negates anything that its existence could be contingent upon. Now let's try to prove the objection in the same way by using, let's say, a flying 1986 geometro. Just by changing our definition, we're unable to get off the ground from the start because there's nothing about the definition of the 1986 flying geometro that implies it has to exist by the logical axiom. Actually, quite the opposite. By definition, we have something that's very contingent. So if we say that a flying 1986 geometro is the greatest possible thing that could be imagined, we have a logical contradiction. However, what happens when we rearrange our definition? The greatest possible being that could be imagined, which is a flying 1986 geometro. We now have a necessary being, but it's not by the way of being a flying geometro. It's by way of being the greatest possible thing imaginable. It's plausible that God is a geometro, but the fact that it's a flying geometro doesn't make it God. It's because it's the greatest thing imaginable. This is kind of like the truth all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. One smaller definition can fit within a larger one. All definitions of God could be geometros, but not all geometros could be God, because God exists by its nature as the greatest thing imaginable, not by nature of being a geometro. Now that we've got that out of the way, we know that this being exists, but what exactly does it look like? Imagine our universe, whether it had a beginning or it's eternal, whether it was started or something keeps it going, whatever it is responsible for all of reality because that's what we mean when we say the universe. It means everything that exists. This force, whether personal or impersonal, would necessarily have to contain all perfections within reality because all perfections demonstrated in the universe were either directly caused by it or are maintained by it. We know this because the law of causation tells us that no effect can be greater than its cause. These perfections or entities can't all be singularly autonomous because if they were, they'd all be working against one another and we'd have chaos rather than the balance and harmony we do see in our universe. By the same chain of reasoning, this force would have to be all-powerful because it exercises its influence over all reality either through putting it in motion, keeping it in motion, or both. It would also have to be all-knowing because knowledge is just the possession of information, and this being contains the origin of all reality within itself. There's no part of reality that is outside of itself. So by this train of thought, we have a being whose non-existence is impossible, which is not dependent on anything else, which is perfect, all-powerful, and all-knowing. Winner, winner, chicken dinner, we have God. I know what you're possibly thinking. Yeah, all right, but this doesn't prove God is conscious or even personal, it just proves something has all of these qualities described. And fair enough. This idea that there is a God, but he doesn't know or care about you, is actually pretty common. In fact, it was held by the ancient philosopher Aristotle, and it's held today by plenty of smart guys. But if this entity contains all perfection, then it would also have to contain the maximum perfection of personhood. A fish is more of a person than a rock. A puppy is more of a person than a fish, and a human is more of a person than a puppy, which proves that personhood exists on a scale, and if it exists on a scale, God has the maximum as we've argued before. Now, someone might say, well, if God is the cause of all, then he also contains the non-personhood of the rock. So is he both a person and not a person? No, he's not, because not a person is not a perfection. It's a lack of a perfection. Coca-Cola not being Pepsi isn't a descriptor because negative descriptors don't actually describe anything. Coca-Cola is not a lemon. Coca-Cola is not a 49-year-old man. Coca-Cola is not a Filipino transgender man who identifies as a palm tree. We could go on and on without actually saying anything about what Coca-Cola is. That being said, negative qualities aren't qualities. Further, we know God is a person because abstract entities don't have causative power. The number 2 can't paint a picture. A square can't beat a bunch of posers at Madden 25, but a person can, and to maintain the scientific empiricism of an atheist, we can't say that they can just in the cause of creation because we've never actually observed abstract entities causing anything. So now we have a necessary being who is perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful, and personal. Now this is where we're probably going to get a lot of head-scratching and mockery because to an atheist, this being sounds nothing like the Christian God. To them, the Christian God is some old sky daddy who sits in the clouds caring way too much about what we do. But in actuality, this being that we've just spent the last 20 or so minutes describing is what we mean by the Christian God. We mean the greatest being conceivable, that which no greater being can be conceived. But what kind of being can possibly have all of these qualities other than existence itself? Think of it. I am who am. Existence itself is the greatest possible being and is the Christian God. And to prove that, I'm going to need another video. So if you don't want to miss that future video, please subscribe and hit the bell. And if you don't care about that video, but you found this one to be of value, please like, comment, share, or whatever you deem to be appropriate. Also, if you think this video sucked and that I'm a huge dingus, please let me know in the comments, and I appreciate that despite thinking these things, you decided to stick around. Thanks for watching and keep seeking the truth.